Our story revolves around Frank Abagnale Jr., a young man who enjoys a comfortable life in New Rochelle, New Jersey, with his parents, Frank Sr. and Paula. During an event at the New Rochelle Rotary Club, Frank Jr. watches his father being recognized for his accomplishments. Later that night, Frank Sr. narrates the romantic tale of how he met Paula, while mother and son share a dance. One morning, Frank Sr. invites his son to skip school and accompany him to an important meeting. This involves borrowing a suit from a reluctant tailor, who eventually gives in when Frank Sr. uses a charming trick involving a gold necklace. With his son in the borrowed suit, they head to Chase and Manhattan Bank, where Frank Sr. fails to secure a loan due to an ongoing tax fraud investigation, trading in their car instead. The Abagnale family's finances continue to dwindle, forcing them to vacate their home. Despite their dire circumstances, Frank Sr. gifts his son a checkbook on his 16th birthday and opens a bank account for him with a starting balance of $25. As a result of their financial situation, Frank Jr. is enrolled in public school. On his first day, wearing his private school uniform, Frank Jr. decides to impersonate a substitute teacher, a ploy which is well received by his classmates. Upon discovery, Frank's parents are taken aback, though his father secretly admires his son's cunning. A startling revelation shatters Frank Jr.'s world when he discovers his mother in a compromising situation with his father's friend, Jack. Things take a turn for the worse when his parents announce their impending divorce, asking him to choose with whom he'd like to live. Unable to make a decision, Frank Jr. flees to the train station and embarks on a nomadic lifestyle. Over the following months, Frank Jr. uses the checkbook his father gifted him to finance his stay in hotels and other makeshift accommodations, despite the checks being fraudulent as he had no real funds. As our story progresses, Frank, who is still underage, attempts to portray himself as an older professional to secure a loan. He delves into forgery, altering documents and checks, but he's still a novice and fails to convince the banks. Leaving yet another bank after a failed loan application, Frank passes by a tailor's shop displaying a pilot's uniform. He watches a dashing pilot and his crew step out of a cab, and the sight captivates him. Inspired by the respect and admiration commanded by the pilot, Frank decides to impersonate one himself. Disguising as a high school student interviewing a professional at the airport for a school article, he collects necessary information to aid his impersonation. With smart maneuvers, he acquires an official uniform and even produces fake payroll checks that Pan Am Air employees can cash in. He finds himself on a plane as a deadhead, not knowing what the term means. Luckily for him, a deadhead refers to a pilot hitching a free ride for repositioning, not someone who has to fly the plane. Using his charms and cunning, he amasses millions through his fraudulent checks. In an attempt to cheer his father up, Frank surprises him with a Cadillac. However, Frank Sr., worried about arousing IRS suspicions, refuses to accept it. He promises to continue fighting to reunite their family, which is Frank Jr.'s deepest wish. Enter Carl Hanratty, an unyielding FBI agent who's tracking Frank due to his check frauds. He finds Frank's hotel room and confronts him. Frank, with his unruffled demeanor, convinces Carl that he's a Secret Service agent named Barry Allen. He distracts Carl long enough to make a swift exit, leaving Carl with an empty wallet. Evolving as a con artist, Frank continues his ruse as a student writing an aviation paper. After he is revealed as the Skyway Man, a con artist posing as a pilot in an article, he's inspired to mimic James Bond's lifestyle. He buys the same suit and car that James Bond uses in the recent movie and even spends a night with a woman he meets at a hotel. On Christmas Eve, Carl, alone in his office, receives a call from Frank who apologizes for tricking him before and proposes a meeting. However, Carl, seeing through the bluff, needles Frank for having no one else to call, leading to Frank hanging up. The next day, Carl, dining alone in a diner, looks up Barry Allen in the phone book, discovering several addresses under the name. The saga continues with Carl realizing Frank is just a child, after a young waiter identifies Barry Allen as the alter ego of the fictional superhero, The Flash. Following this revelation, Carl rallies his team to investigate every missing child case, hoping to identify Frank. This leads them to Frank's remarried mother, Paula, who provides a yearbook photo that helps Carl finally put a face to the name. In the meantime, Frank lives a lavish lifestyle, throwing parties funded by his fraudulent money. At one of these parties, a friend gets hurt, leading Frank to a hospital where he meets a young nurse named Brenda Strong. Frank is instantly smitten and, to impress Brenda, claims to be a doctor. Through his guile, Frank manages to secure a supervisory position as a doctor named Frank Connors at the hospital where Brenda works. Their budding affection matures into romance, culminating in a shared kiss in Frank's office. However, their intimate moment is disrupted when Frank is summoned to the ER to attend to a boy injured in a bike accident. Despite his utter lack of medical knowledge, Frank successfully bluffs his way out of the situation. Parallel to these events, Carl Hanratty pays a visit to Frank Sr. and quickly identifies the source of Frank Jr.'s cunning persona. Despite Frank Sr.'s evasiveness about his son, Carl spots letters from Frank Jr. and notes down the return address. Eventually, Frank confesses his genuine feelings to Brenda and proposes marriage. During a meeting with Brenda's parents, Frank fibs again, claiming to be a lawyer like Brenda's father. Despite Brenda's father's initial skepticism, he eventually grants Frank his blessing, misinterpreting Frank's confession of his real identity, a teenager in love with his daughter, as a metaphor. Frank even manages to pass the Louisiana bar exam and starts working at Brenda's father's law firm, despite a shaky start. Feeling melancholic while watching Brenda's happy family, Frank meets his father in a bar to share his aspiration to reunite their family. However, Frank Sr., now working at the post office, shatters Frank Jr.'s hopes with the news of Paula's remarriage. Despite Frank's desire to cease running, his father encourages him to persist. On Christmas Eve, Frank calls Carl, proposing a truce and sharing news of his impending wedding. Carl, however, reaffirms his duty to catch him. This call tips Carl off about Frank's future plans. Knowing Frank won't change his surname as he's marrying, Carl locates Frank and Brenda's wedding. At the sight of Carl, Frank retreats, followed by Brenda, and confesses his true identity to her. He instructs her to meet him at the airport in 2 days before they share a heart-wrenching goodbye. By the time Carl enters the room, Frank is long gone, setting the stage for the next chapter of their cat-and-mouse chase. 2 days after the wedding, Frank waits for Brenda at the airport, spotting her in a pink top. He feels both elated to see her and dismayed when he realizes she's following instructions from a concealed earpiece. He quickly leaves the airport, understanding that the FBI is nearby. Frank then devises a plan to return to the airport, impersonating a pilot and offering a fake internship program to 8 young women from a nearby school. Despite the large number of airline security personnel, Frank, in his pilot's uniform, enters the airport surrounded by his entourage of beautiful interns, successfully distracting the male security officers and escaping the country. 7 months later, the FBI is nearly ready to give up the chase for Frank, except for Carl, who remains determined to apprehend him. Carl discovers that the checks Frank has been using are genuine, and learns from experts that the machine capable of producing such checks exists abroad. This leads him to Frank's mother's village in France, where he finally locates Frank on Christmas Eve. He finds Frank in a check factory, producing checks in large quantities. A weary and frightened Frank greets Carl like an old friend. Despite his anger at Frank's escapades, Carl shows a protective side, warning Frank about the French police's intent to kill him. Frank surrenders to Carl, only to be arrested by the French police and subjected to harsh conditions in prison. Eventually, Carl manages to extradite Frank back to the United States. On the plane, Frank learns of his father's death and, overcome with grief, escapes from the plane to visit his mother. Seeing her happily remarried with a young daughter, Frank feels all his hopes dashed and finally surrenders to Carl and the FBI. He is sentenced to 12 years in maximum security prison. Throughout his sentence, Carl visits Frank and presents him with a fraudulent check case he's been working on. Frank immediately identifies the bank teller's involvement in the scheme. Impressed, Carl arranges for Frank to serve the rest of his sentence working for the FBI Bank Fraud Unit. One day, Frank is reminded of his past when he sees a pilot uniform in a tailor shop. Feeling lonely and despondent over the weekend, Frank succumbs to his old habits and tries to board a plane in a pilot uniform. Carl intercepts him, telling Frank that he is no longer being pursued and if he decides to leave, he won't stop him, as he believes Frank will return. Come Monday, Carl waits anxiously to see what decision Frank has made. To his relief, Frank returns to assist him with his case, finally finding a place where he belongs. Based on a true story, Frank Abagnale Jr. has since married and is now a father to 3 sons. He has become one of the world's leading experts on bank fraud and forgery, living in the Midwest. He has managed to build a successful career, all the while maintaining a friendship with Carl Hanratty.